most of these vlogs are something that I do just kind of like on a whim. I'll get a I get a thought in my head, something that pops in my head. I'll think about it for a few minutes, and then I'm like, maybe that's something I want to talk about. And so they usually start out, and then I just kind of let them take me wherever they go. That's why there's like some with a lot of stammering, a lot of trying to find the words, a lot of thought, a lot of thinking. Kind of just they're just kind of like thoughts as they come to me off of a main topic of something that pops in my head, something I like to talk about. But this one doesn't have much direction at all, but it's kind of something that I think about a lot. And I heard somebody say something. I heard David Goggins say something one day, and it kind of sticks to me. And he says that your mind has a tactical advantage over you. And I was like, think about that. And yeah, I don't know if people are like me, but like I'm constantly like having conversations in my head. I know you got two parts in your brain. I have like two parts in my head. I have my higher self and my lesser self, basically. So I guess I have what I would call the ego. And the ego would normally the ego is what I would consider my lesser self. And then you have your true self or your higher self. You have the one that's not led by the ego. That's kind of your other side. Your other side is your conscience. The other side is the one telling you what you should do. That's your conscience coming in. Conscience, I heard somebody say your conscience is the authentic voice of God. And I believe that. I think your conscience is your higher self trying to guide you and direct you. And the other voice, the one that you hear telling you to do things that you maybe don't really want to do, or you kind of know is wrong, or maybe it's kind of out of character, or it's not in alignment with your true self and your higher self. That is what I would call the ego. Now, the ego is extremely powerful. I've learned a lot about the ego over the last year, but really the last like 4 or 5, 6 months, I've really dove deep into learning a lot about the ego, studying a lot of Carl Jung, studying a lot of guys or people that have taken more of a spiritual path. Like I've kind of been on, I've got knocked off of it, and I feel like I'm not really living in alignment with that spiritual path that I've been on, but I'm trying to get back on it. But I think now it's hard for me to get back on it because the ego knows that when I'm on that, the ego knows when the ego knows that when I get in alignment with that spiritual path, that the ego is not going to have the power. And the ego is not something, the ego isn't real. The ego is basically a computer programming that's been written in your mind to control or entrap your higher self or your true self. I'm not saying the ego is bad. I'm not saying that you don't need the ego. I'm saying that if you're living a life that's controlled by the ego, that you're not living a life that's in alignment with your higher self. When people transcend the ego, when they understand the ego and they use the ego to better themselves, to live in alignment with their higher selves, and that's when they become a very, very, very enlightened, spiritual, and powerful person, because now they know how to use the ego properly. They've integrated their shadow, and they know how to use that. I forget who it is. I think it's Jordan Peterson, but he said that the shadow is the strongest part of your psyche that you could possibly have, but you have to learn to control. You have to integrate it. You have to identify it, understand it, and integrate it. And this kind of goes back to David Goggins, what he said about the mind having a tactical advantage over you. The ego knows what to do to stay in control. The ego is that part in your mind that knows your insecurities. It knows your fears. It knows things that you're not good at. Mine knows my insecurities, and it uses those. It knows my negative self-talk, and it uses that. It knows my self-doubt, and it uses that to stay in control, because the ego doesn't want to lose control. The ego is something that we as humans have developed. I talked about this before, but it's something that is developed in humans as a means to survival, because the ego does serve a purpose. The ego is what has gotten us to evolve and develop into what we are today. It's gotten us through the primitive stages of our evolution. Had it not been for the ego, we would not have survived. We would not have had the drive to learn, to be better, and to evolve and basically survive. It's the survival of the fittest, and the ego knows that it has to develop itself into the fittest to survive, and that's what it does. But learning to control it, learning that tactical advantage that the mind has over you, and turning that into a strong point is probably like one of the hardest things to do. It is extremely hard to understand your own insecurities and realize that these are just made up insecurities by the ego. These are insecurities that are created for the ego to live within the identity that it has created. The person that I have been presenting most of my life unknowingly isn't necessarily in alignment with my true self. It's more of the persona that the ego has created, the identity that the ego has created, and then it's presented a persona, and that's what the ego is trying to do. It's trying to save that with everything that it can. I've talked about in an earlier vlog that the ego will fight till its death to preserve itself, and it will. And I feel like for me right now, I'm struggling so much because I have been on that spiritual path, and I had transcended the ego, and I had kind of overcame a lot of this stuff. And then like some things happened that kind of knocked me off that spiritual path and brought that back out. And now it's extremely hard to, like, now the ego seems like the ego is fighting even harder because it knows that, well, you know, if he overcomes this again, most likely the ego is not going to be in control and doesn't want to lose control.